Hello everyone, this is Philosophy 74, right? Ethics. And we are doing now week 10. We did Spinoza last time, sections from part 1 of the Ethics, right? The appendix to part 1, just a few pages, and also the preface to part 4. I touched on the very beginning, the outset of part 3, and then moved to part 4, right? We saw a few pages from the beginning, the preface, right? And so this is part 3, which is over the semester, right? It's called the Ethics of Civility. Again, just to review briefly what we had done so far. We started with an introduction to ethics, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha. We did the pre-Socratics, then in part 2 of the class, and Socrates and Plato. And also we did, of course, Aristotle, and right from the Ethics of Aristotle, then Epictetus, and Kitei, right, on dependency and care. And also, I said, read the chapter from one chapter from my book, right, Earth to the Plenitudes. And so, in any case, Spinoza last week, that was week 9, on the questions, important questions like concepts, the emotions, bondage, freedom, and so on. And again, remember, do write your discussion board entry. So today, the class for today, and then after today, after this week, we had 2 weeks left before the end of this, unusual and difficult semester. So the class from today, I call this, right, the key words are philosophizing, right? You see, philosophizing with a hammer, which is from Nietzsche. It's from another place in Nietzsche's work, not what we are reading today, and then a colon, guilt and death. Okay, so philosophizing with a hammer means that for Nietzsche we had to destroy everything, right, and build something new. As he says at one point, in the book that we are reading from, on the genealogy of morals, or of morality. That's the translation that we are using, right, on the genealogy of morality. We are reading essay 2, only the second essay for this class, right? And but that's what he says at one point, in order to build a new temple, right, you had to destroy the old one. I mean, basically, in Nietzsche, you had this idea, and we can't go into that. I do that more when I teach modern philosophy. But I just mentioned these questions here as well. In Nietzsche, you had this critique of everything, basically critique of metaphysics. That we saw when we did Socrates and Plato, right? Precisely, especially the philosophy coming from Plato, metaphysics, as the split between appearance, what appears, what seems to be the case, and essence, right? Nietzsche is not in agreement with this type of philosophy, right? So the instructional metaphysics, which is this type of philosophy coming for Nietzsche from Plato, and also the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is under attack by Nietzsche, because they share, right, Platonism, the philosophy of Plato, and the metaphysics, and the Judeo-Christian tradition. They share this general, paradigm, framework, right, whereby this world, this life is not the real world, the real life. It is only a copy for Plato. It is a passage, right, for in the Judeo-Christian other religious traditions. But but Nietzsche is actually, saying, look, this is actually a fable. This is a fairy tale. This is a lie, right? He says, we are not reading other things by Nietzsche, but another book that I use with philosophy, right, with modern philosophy, you can check that out as well. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a great book. He says precisely there, remain faithful, remain close to the earth, and to the body. There is no other, level. Other, just like we saw with Spinoza. Remember, with Spinoza, God is nature, nature is God. The model that I mentioned last time of immanence rather than transcendence, we have something similar, the same in Nietzsche. And actually, again, we are doing only this great essay from on the genealogy of morals, essay 2. But one probably thing that you will see if you check more, read more on Nietzsche, you will see one of the most famous, perhaps infamous statement by Nietzsche is precisely uh, God is dead, right? I mean, so we go from God is nature, nature is God, God equals nature in Spinoza to this further, extension of the critique of theology of metaphysics, which is precisely to say, as Nietzsche says, God is dead. So, but that's important because that's the idea also that we are looking at, to philosophize, to do philosophy with a hammer, to destroy everything, destroy metaphysics, destroy religion, destroy morality, right? I mean, the moralizing morality, where people tell other people what to do, what not to do, and so on and so forth. This universal that we saw ideas in when we did Socrates, Plato, and so on, right? These universal ideas of mm, good and bad, good and evil, and so on, are called into question by Nietzsche, right? Just like they were by Spinoza. Right? Remember the relative value that we saw in Spinoza already, right? I mean, perfect, imperfect, good, bad, beautiful, ugly, and so on and so forth. And with Nietzsche too, we have this idea that actually essay 1 in this book on the genealogy of morals, you can check that as well, right? The title is Good and Bad and Good and Evil, right? And I don't want to go into that now because I want to focus and I don't want to be too long on essay 2 because that's what I asked you to read. And actually, right, I mean, do write your discussion board entry precisely on this critique of the critique that the attack by Nietzsche on morality, religion, metaphysics, and maybe look for a particular passage, a quote that you find relevant. I will mention some of them today that and build on it, say something about it. Okay, so we have a completely different view of ethics that we might have seen in other situations. The title for the second essay that begins for you on page 35, right, is Guilt in Scare. Quote, right, in quotation marks, bad conscience and related matters. Okay, and the beginning is very interesting, right? I mean, the beginning is on the question of mm, promise, the promise that we are asked, to make all the time. The question, therefore, of having to remember. This is important because the construction of a memory will be an important point in this second essay by Nietzsche, and the fact that we cannot forget. So this fact that we cannot forget, we are not allowed to forget, and that we had to remember and therefore build a memory on the basis of promises that we make. That is also the beginning of responsibility and what for Nietzsche people also understand as freedom, the free will that he completely dismisses. He says there is no free will whatsoever, right? In any case, the beginning is really nice. The outset, he says, to breed an animal, and that's get used to the language in Nietzsche, which is also, I mean, of course, there is irony here, but also there is a very colorful, to say the least, a powerful, at times even maybe kind of a violent language, right? So that is why also Nietzsche, just like Spinoza, is considered has been and is considered even now a dangerous philosopher in many ways. Okay, so he's and controversial. I can't go into that now, but there is this aspect in Nietzsche, in the interpretation of Nietzsche as well, the reception. So since he, because Nietzsche is a philosopher of right the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. He dies exactly in the year 1900. That's then what comes after that is the 20th century, a century of violence. As we know, in many ways, we can say that Nietzsche was prophetic, right? And also then the 21st century, which is our century right now, which is also apparently seems to be the first two decades, also a century of violence. So Nietzsche is, in a sense, interested in opening people's eyes, right? In saying precisely that all the things that we believe in typically are lies, and again, religion, metaphysics, morality, and that he also says we had to, I said that before, destroy everything, build something new. There is a destructive but also a constructive part in Nietzsche's thought. We cannot go into that, but just for you to know, this new construction would be this, transvaluation of all values for Nietzsche would be precisely moving from the ground of the plane of metaphysics, religion, morality, onto the plane of aesthetics. Aesthetics, that's the word we usually use when we speak about art, the beautiful, but aesthetics, the senses, right? Because the word aesthetics comes, you can check that, check the etymology from the Greek language, aesthesis, the senses, therefore the body, right? So for Nietzsche, basically, we cannot rely on the metaphysical, religious, moral tradition and so on. We had to invent our own values. So we are on our own, and we had to precisely, make of our life a work of art, right? So that's the aesthetic, move. That's the passage from again everything from the past, morality, metaphysics, religion, to art. Art, okay? Art is what our life should be. That doesn't mean that we had to paint, or that too, maybe if we want to, do something artistic, but existence, life as such, should be, our own creation, our own invention. Okay, so in any case, let me read a few very important and some of them wonderful, thought provoking, because that's what Nietzsche is really interested in, is doing passages, right? So then choose one or two that you particularly like and write, elaborate on them. Okay, so to breed an animal, I'm reading from, page, the top of page 35, the beginning of the second essay. To breed an animal with the prerogative to promise, in italics, right? Is that not precisely the paradoxical task which nature has set herself with regard to humankind? Is it not the real problem of humankind? So, I mean, there is some irony, but also, some truth. And then he goes into the question of forgetfulness, right? Which is something that we are not allowed to, practice, to engage in. See, the essay is divided into sections. At the beginning of section 2, then he says that this is precisely what constitutes, right, the long history of the origins of responsibility, set in italics. That's what I told you before already, right? That because I had to remember, I am not allowed to forget. Forget what? I mean, just, a concrete example. I can't forget that I had to pay rent. I can't forget that I had to go to work. I'm not allowed to do so, right? So the construction of this memory, which is sorry, the same as the construction for Nietzsche of one's conscience, or the soul, whatever we call the soul, right? And remember, Nietzsche is engaging in this critique of religion, right? Is precisely, the origins, the long history of the origins of responsibility. I become a responsible person precisely in that way. And then what we have, and this is fictitious for Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, this is still in the second section of this essay, the top of page 37, right? He attacks this idea, this myth, this false idea, right? This fiction of the sovereign individual. You see that at the top of right? The page, we spoke already, I believe, about sovereignty at times, right? The sovereign individual, again, set in italics, right? The individual who says, I do as I please. I'm independent and sovereign, right? No one tells me what to do. This is a fiction, right? This is, what the individual itself, right? And we saw that when we did Kitei, especially, and the question of dependency and care, and we spoke about that, and with Spinoza too. If you go back to the video, remember when we touched on the outset of book 3, the kingdom within a kingdom, right? I do as I please in my own life. I am the decider, and so on and so forth. And as Nietzsche will say in a moment, the master of a free will. Right, the master of free will. This is precisely, Nietzsche says, a fiction, but we saw again already when we were reading the other material. Again, I mentioned Kitei again, and Spinoza, that there is, actually there is this interdependence, right, all the time, and not the independence that some people display, which is false, okay? And then precisely the prerogative, right, of this sovereign individual, so-called, is to promise, right? I mean, think about the common practice of making promises at the moral level, interpersonal relations, and so on and so forth, legal level. The promissory note that we sign if we, borrow, right, if we take a loan, and so on and so forth, right? So the promise always is related to the fact of having to pay back. And we'll speak about this again. Guilt, bad conscience. He will say at one point, I will show you how guilt and debt, right? They are the same. They are related in linguistically in German, in the German language. Schuld and Schuld. I mean, we will see that in a moment. But the idea, I had to pay back. I mean, this paying back can happen in a monetary way, right? I had to pay back. I had to pay money, right, back, or time. Because the language that we find also, think about that. I mean, in finance, in the economy is also the language, and in morality of guilt and debt and so on is also the language that we find in criminal justice. We spoke already at the beginning of this class. The question was that of the distinction precisely that we studied, and I said this will be with us throughout the semester, between right, ethics and the law, right? So same idea. So in the criminal justice type of language, the language of the law in general, we find the same type of terminology, right? Guilt, debt, to pay back one's debt to society, right? In terms of the prison, right? Type of language and so on. So, but Nietzsche says, ironically again, this man who is now free, I'm reading, free, again, set in italics, who actually has the prerogative to promise, prerogative, this privilege, right? this master of right, the free, again in italics, will, master of the free will, right? This sovereign. Okay, all these things are said by Nietzsche in certainly an ironic, to say the least, way. I mean, of course, all this is fictional, right? So remember, the free will doesn't exist, right? And so, in any case, we can't read everything together, but at the end of this section, he says, the last line in this section, this sovereign human being, right, calls whatever, this, remember, responsibility, the conscience, his conscience, one's conscience, which is the same, which, and then he starts section 3 with a question, right, his conscience, question mark, and then he goes into that, and then as I said, also the question of the construction of a memory, which is this is the result of that process, that construction, which is a violent and cruel process. That's what Nietzsche says. It happens in a very violent and bloody, he says, way. Think about torture and so on and so forth. I mean, and Nietzsche says this is what the construction of a memory then is. And it is in the middle of a page, precisely 38, that you see after a semicolon, it's highlighted for you. Perhaps there is nothing more terrible and strange in man's prehistory than his technique of mnemonics, which is the construction of a memory, a technique, right? I mean, so we get our memory and therefore our conscience, our soul, and so forth by, undergoing this process of I can't go, deeper into that, but this process, I hope this is clear. But again, contact me with questions. If you have this process of internalization of something, for example, the internalization of one's guilt, I really become the guilty one when I internalize, my guilt, right? When if I am told that I am the guilty one, then I internalize it. And so, the process of, let me put it this way, because this is what is for Nietzsche terrible and strange and cruel and violent. The process of normalization, that's what he's speaking about. Institutionalization, right? I mean, we are always, to various degrees, institutionalized, right? And we are normalized, right? The question as to whether we are normal or abnormal, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, these categories of right, the law, again, about the medical sciences, psychology, and so on and so forth, or sociology and so on. I mean, but in reality, we are normalized, and this is what Nietzsche is speaking about. And this normalization happens in, a terrible and in a violent, to various degrees, way, through techniques whereby we, construct our own memory, and therefore our own conscience, and our own subjectivity, our own character, and so on and so forth. Okay? So this is what he says again on this page. Again, we are on page, right? 38, again highlighted. Look at that. Right, when a man decided that he had to make a memory for himself, it never happened without blood, torments, and sacrifices. Right, the most horrifying sacrifices and forfeits, the sacrifice, he says in parentheses, of the firstborn belongs here. The most disgusting mutilations, that's the language that Nietzsche uses, I said that at the beginning. For example, again in parentheses, castration, the cruelest, right, most cruel, the cruelest rituals of all religious cults. And again in parentheses he says something very strong, and all religions are at their most fundamental systems of cruelty. Think about that, whether you agree, disagree, what you might say if you choose, for example, this passage or similar passages, say what you think about what Nietzsche is doing, right? So, in any case, this is very important. That's the construction of memory. And then precisely he ends this section with the question of reason. That's the way in which reason, to be rational, to be reasonable, and so on, also comes, that's where it comes from, right? I mean, he says with the aid of this sort of memory, that's the last few lines, from this section 3 on again page this time 39, right? With the aid of this sort of memory that we produce, we are forced to produce, right? So much for freedom, Nietzsche says, and free will, right? We are forced to engage in these kind of techniques whereby we construct our memory. So then he says, with the aid of that, people finally came to reason, scare quote, right? Reason, I mean, not reason, for example, in the book that I mentioned before, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or in other places too. Nietzsche says the body actually has more reason than whatever we call, the mind, the intellect, and so on. The body is a great and greater reason, he says, okay? But the reason that he mentions here is, right, reason, right, is precisely the same as one's conscience, one's memory. Reason, he continues, solemnity, mastering of emotions, this really dismal thing called, right, reflection. All these privileges and splendors man has, what a price had to be paid for them, right? I mean, so see, the language is very powerful, right? How much blood and horror lies at the basis of all good things. Think about history. The history, I don't know, I'm just, suggesting, just a pointer, the history of conquest, right? That began with the beginning precisely of modernity, the modern age, right? With the so-called age of age, and then right, what came with it, uh, uh, the conquest of right by Europe, the various European powers. And actually Nietzsche is really, his critique, when he criticizes the modern human being, modern man, he usually he means the modern European man, right? So the history of conquest and the history of whatever then we call civilization and culture, that Nietzsche says it's the madhouse, like insanity, madhouse, right, of culture, he says, right? And we will see probably in a moment, but otherwise you will find it because it's highlighted. In any case, for you, read everything, but read, especially pay attention to those sections. But colonialism, imperialism, and so on. I mean, all whatever then, in quote again, good things. I mean, everything is based ultimately, when we speak about civilization and so on and so forth, right? How much blood and horror lies, Nietzsche says, at the basis of all this. Okay, so and it is. Then in this section 4, page 39, that what I was telling you about the German word for right, guilt and debts, right? That's where he says the main moral concept should, guilt, this sense comes from right, the very material concept of Schulden, which is debts. Okay, so guilt and debt, and this is also, I leave that to you to think about. Really interesting, because it is very common that people who are in a situation of debt, and today everybody is. I mean, we live in right, precisely the debt economy, whatever people call credit economy, is the debt economy, right? Debt is so widespread at all levels of life. I mean, people are ultimately, one might say, I leave that, think about this, that people are already born in a situation of debt, right? So that, and usually, right, there is this common feeling that people have if they are in a situation of that, they also feel guilty, right? Or there is a sense of shame or guilt, and certainly society, the system, you know, wants people to feel that way, right? I mean, I perhaps then I had this sense that I have failed, right, and so on and so forth, right? So Nietzsche is criticizing all these things, okay, and so again, he is what he says is in many ways, right, thought provoking, right? Although the provocation at times is maybe a bit too strong, right? And some people may have issues with that. But you know, again, I leave that to you to think about. You know what this means. Then he speaks of shame, also on. Right in section 7 page 43 and how man is the animal, right? Man right, scare quote, man is the animal who then becomes ashamed of all right, of all his instincts, he says, right? So shame, guilt, and so on and so forth, and this is what these are, if you will, some of punishment, torture, including these are some of the ingredients, if you will, of what we call then normalcy, what it is to be normal, normalization, civilization, right, and so on. And in any case, then there is this question of resentment. The word is ressentiment, the French spelled with double S, but it's the same idea. He uses that spelling, the French word resentment. On page 49, there is, you know, an interesting quote in that sense, and then he calls into question the distinction between just and unjust. Okay, think about that also on page 50. And okay, again, you know, like I said, I don't want to be too long, but read, you know, basically everything, especially, again, I say this again, pay attention to the highlighted parts, okay? But then there is a great quote that I want to read with you, and maybe you may want to consider this, you know, as the quote, the passage on which to elaborate, you know, to write about, but you can also give an account of what Nietzsche is doing in this second essay, okay? But this is, again, section, like I said, 16, page 56, okay? Where he says, I look on bad conscience, right? Bad conscience is part of the title, guilt, bad conscience, and related matters. What is this conscience, bad conscience? As a serious illness. So the modern human being, modern man, is ill for Nietzsche. Okay, remember, European, especially when he was writing, that's what he had in mind. Today is a more perhaps global view that we might take on this, but it is. Remember that I said that one of the most important statements by Nietzsche, famous, infamous, is God is dead. And we have killed him, he says. Okay, I can go further into that, but he says, and man, modern man, is dying because, you know, modern man is ill and therefore dying. And then I can't go into that, but I just, you know, then you can Google this as well. For Nietzsche, remember I spoke about the transvaluation of all values, how we had to make this passage from religion, morality, metaphysics that must be destroyed, right, into art, the passage to art, aesthetics, and go from man to the Overman. Okay, think about this concept. In German would be Übermensch, the overman or the overhuman, that which comes after, right? The being that comes after man also dies because God is dead, man is dying, he's ill, and so on, right? I mean, man, the human being, right? So in any case, of course, right, that can be, I leave that to you to think about, but I also, offer this key just to make sure that we don't once again misunderstand Nietzsche. It is also metaphorical, okay? Just we cannot take this in the literal sense, like many of the things that Nietzsche says should be interpreted. They cannot be taken literally, okay? So in any case, I look on bad conscience as a serious illness to which man was forced to succumb. Think about the, you know, language, how powerful the language is. Man was forced through the techniques that we spoke about before to succumb to this illness, right? By precisely, I continue reading, the pressure of the most fundamental of all changes which he experienced, the change whereby, and this is great, this is very powerful, very perhaps maybe controversial, debatable, but it is important, the change whereby he finally found himself imprisoned within the confines of society and peace. Right, think about this. I just offer maybe a key for your reading, then you think about this, but usually words like society and peace, just like civilization and culture, they are seen as positive words, right? And yet, the word prison, imprison, is used here too, right? The human being was forced to succumb to this illness when precisely he found himself in prison, caught. It's a situation of capture, right? In prison within the confines of society and peace, right? I can't go further deeper into that. I may just share with you. You can Google that. There is a philosopher who comes after Nietzsche, of course, closer to us in the 20th century. I believe he died in 1984. Michel Foucault, right? You can check that. Foucault. Okay, Michel Foucault, who draws so much from Nietzsche and writes precisely on the question of institutionalization, normalization. He wrote so much about, for example, the institutions. One book is called uh, Discipline and Punish, the birth of the prison, right? Then he wrote on the question of insanity and the birth of psychiatry, in the psychiatric hospital, and so, the history of madness and the history of sexuality, and so on and so forth. But in any case, in this book, Discipline and Punish, which is really based in many ways, in important ways, not only but also based on this second essay by Nietzsche that we are doing, reading together. He says then, of course, that today the prison is extended to society as a whole, right? And probably we witness this even more so today. I mean, let alone when Nietzsche was writing, he died in the year 1900, or Foucault, right? But today even more so, perhaps. But in any case, that's the change whereby the human being found himself in prison, okay, within the confines of society and peace. Society and peace, right, civilization and culture, and so on and so forth. These are a kind of a prison, and as I said, Michel Foucault, then drawing from Nietzsche, then he will say that society is, that the prison is extended to the whole of society. Okay, think about that today in what we call, with already Foucault, but today even more so, the society of control, the society of surveillance, right? Today, even importantly, digital surveillance, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in any case, that's the consciousness, which is built, right, produced, made, right, via these techniques that one is forced to engage in, and train with, and this is, on page actually 57. Then the second highlight for you is also great, and I mentioned this already before, but I go back. All instincts which are not discharged outwardly turn inwards. This is what I call the internalization of man. Okay, I spoke about this process of this word internalization, which is key for us in understanding also, the process of institutionalization, normalization, the making of whatever we understand the self today, and so on. And Nietzsche continues after the colon with it. There now evolves in man what will later be called his soul. Again, in scare quotes, soul, conscience, memory, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, and again, the question of, at the end of section 16, page 58, then he speaks about more or less what I mentioned before, that you would find more clearly if you read, that spoke Zarathustra, but the idea of the passage, the transition, right, from the old to the new, if you will, from, this transvaluation of all values, this going from morality, the moralizing morality, metaphysics, religion, to art, and to, something new, from man to the over man, or the over human, as though he says at the end, I'm reading, men were not an end but just a path, an episode, a bridge, a great promise. Then he speaks about resentment again, but again we can't read everything and together, and I really want to, wrap up, and because it's already being longer than I. But then I also read, and I just point that out, okay, to you. Pay special attention to on page 62, the last maybe about 10 lines of section 20, right? Very important. That too can be taken as, it is certainly very critical of the dominant religions, but and metaphysics. Okay, but it's important, and I leave that up to you to think about and see what you can make of this. Okay, write something as a. So it is here on page between 65, the very end of page towards, and then the top of page 66, where you read what I said at the outset today, at the beginning. If a shrine, a temple, a shrine is to be set up, a shrine has to be destroyed, he says, right? A shrine has to be destroyed, set in italics, right? So the destructive part, the constructive part, right? You demolish, right? Destroy a temple and build a new one, again, metaphorical meaning, of course, right? You have to think about this in a metaphorical sense, and then he mentions actually what I often, a few times I said the name Zarathustra, right, at the end of section 25th, which is really the end of the essay. Okay, he says Zarathustra, right? That's the very short section 25. Zarathustra, the godless, right? Because God is dead, man is also died, is coming and announcing precisely the overman, what comes after man. Well, I hope that this was clear, and again, if you have questions, contact me. I want to schedule soon a Zoom meeting so that we can touch base, and that will be like last time. It would not be a class, but a way of, I like to call it a community meeting, because as a class we are a community as well, and I will send you an email in relation to that. So watch the video, write the read the material, write your discussion entry. This is week 10, then after this we have 2 weeks left. Okay, thank you.